Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. I'm Joshua Sharfstein, Vice Dean for Public Health Practice and Community Engagement, and a former health commissioner here in Baltimore. Our goal is to bring evidence and experience to illuminate critical public health issues. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
Hi, I'm Lindsay Smith Rogers, producer of Public Health on Call. Today, getting ready for Thanksgiving and the possibility of some difficult conversations. Dr. Consuelo Amat, an assistant professor of political science at the SNF Agora Institute, is an expert in peace building and social movements. She speaks with Dr. Josh Sharfstein about how to bridge divides with people in your lives. Let's listen.
Professor Amat, thank you so much for joining me on Public Health on Call. I'm not sure we've had an expert in peace building, and it comes just in time for the holiday season. How are you doing?
Thank you very much, Josh, for having me. It's a pleasure. I'm doing well. Thank you.
So around the time of the holidays, we notice at the school that some of our students, staff, and faculty get stressed because they are going to be with relatives, and sometimes these relatives may have very different types of views on active political questions than they do. And it is really hard.
It is really hard. And I think it's especially hard because it's not just a disagreement about policy and ideas. The political environment has become so polarized that it has to do also with personal animosity against the other. So a process that we call othering. You see others as an enemy, and them as people being wrong part of kind of our communities. The other reason is that usually conversations with family, given that love is there and we feel very close, could be harder and easier in some ways when it comes to difficult issues like racism and xenophobia and things like that. You want to engage, but at the same time, you feel very offended. And so it's very, very difficult to do. And on the other side, they might think that, there's child abuse involved. And so those are very, very touchy issues. And it's very difficult to engage on that level because you feel offended. And there's an environment of high polarization.
What I hear you saying is that it's not just about the merits of the issue. It's not just like a debate, but that we invest it with, big themes of right or wrong and good and evil. And you start to see somebody as the other, like you said. What contributes to that?
Well, recently, I think it has to do a lot with misinformation. I think there's genuine concerning levels of misinformation in the country. And I won't make it equal there. I think the Republican Party is responsible, and a lot of the media associated with it are responsible for a large part of that. And with that comes really crazy conspiracy theories that are very serious. And I think that's one reason, misinformation. The other is just the environment of very high polarization. And the fact that, when we disagree on policy, we can still have that social contract in a democracy where you are okay with the other person winning. Everyone is ruled by the person who won, whether you voted or not. That's a social contract, right? With the understanding that next time we're going to have another race and there's going to be a peaceful transfer of power and you might take your own turn later. And if that is lost, then the stakes are much higher. And so I think that also heightens the problem.
We have examples of people who say, I can't go home. It's too hard. And, you can tell they're in a lot of pain when they say that, but they actually can't. What do you think has happened there?
Right. So I actually think that there's a perfectly normal and justifiable response to this, which is just either avoiding going to Thanksgiving, having an online Thanksgiving or Zoom Thanksgiving to avoid engaging in a deep way. But that's a really sad thing to do. And if there are other ways of, attending these holidays and being with family that will not break you, and there's other options, but it is fine to say, I will not go. It's fine to also put ground rules and say, we will all not talk about these topics about the pandemic. We might say that we won't talk about the pandemic and we won't talk about politics. And then you say, okay, we're all going to go to Thanksgiving and do that and just focus on things that unite us, like sports. And, we all have other identities and things that we can focus on.
So in fact, that might be one way of actually avoiding making things worse is not to go for people as hard as that is. But let's roll up our sleeves and say, okay, I love these people. I want to be with them. I even want to engage with them. I'd like to figure out if there's a way that we can move past this. Maybe partly in my mind, I'm wondering whether I could help them see the error of their ways. I don't know. But how do you do that?
Definitely. So I think three things that I would advise on someone who wants to engage. And I think engagement should be focused more on understanding and dialogue rather than persuasion. So that's the first thing I'll say. The second thing I'll say is that I would focus before having a conversation, engaging about politics and about sensitive issues. I would focus on the beginning of the holiday, kind of renewing ties and remembering why you love the people that you love. It's not just about sharing blood or having relatives that you have because of legal documents, but remember why you like those people to begin with. And so maybe play board games or, just talk about your job or talk about your kids, your children and what they do and what they love to do and things like that. So connecting with people on a non-political level first is so important so that people remember why you're there and why you love them. And then when I talk about the goal of understanding, another thing is, in particular, what that means is to focus on acknowledging the points of view and also seeing where you can find common ground. They say something related to politics. Always remember if they said something you agree with and emphasize that. And also just have the focus of, acknowledging their point of view in addition to providing yours.
So active listening, making sure you hear what they're saying.
Right.
Slowing down enough to do that. And anytime you can find something to say, well, I certainly agree with that, or that's something I care about deeply, that can make it a little bit better.
Definitely, because we have to remember how social identity works. There's really interesting studies that are done on inter-ethnic conflict and dialogue. For example, one in Ethiopia. And they see that, having dialogue with people who disagree can actually heighten problems of polarization because you start listening to the other person you disagree with and you're like, oh, you're actually a really horrible racist person who hates me in particular, right? And so that can make things worse. But there are, if you follow these things about, having the goal of understanding, acknowledging their points of view, finding common ground, and also forging ties beforehand that are apolitical, those things can really lower the chances of that being the outcome of that dialogue. And the reason is that as humans, we really prioritize identities and in-group and out-group differences. And whenever we have a huge polarization like we have now, you see your in-group as you heighten the similarities you have with your in-group, and you really make the differences that you have with the out-group enormous and very important. And so when you do all of these things, in terms of finding common ground and seeing what the other is saying, acknowledging their points of view, what you're doing is you're reducing that problem that we have with social identity and in-group, out-group problems.
So we don't want to go in thinking we're going to convince the person. That may not happen. Your goal is understanding and dialogue. You want to be a good supportive listener and point out where there are areas of agreement to kind of blur the border maybe a little bit of the different groups. What about when it's kind of your turn to talk? How do you advise going about that?
I will say that, there are some moments when you say, well, I can't disengage completely because this is just so important. So for example, when you might think this is about political violence, right? Like this is about saying we can't have violence in our country. We can't other people in our country in a way that leads them to hate them beyond anything. We can't go down the line in terms of racism, xenophobia, et cetera. And so what I would say there is, one, the most important thing is, I said generally to avoid persuasion, but if you're going to try to go on that route, I would say that to remember a few things. One is facts don't really have a lot of weight, unfortunately. We tend to just throw out a bunch of facts to people. That's not going to stick in this environment. What really makes much more of a difference are emotions and personal stories that impact people. The other thing that makes a difference is the Socratic method. It's not easy to do. You have to be really good at it for it to work. And this involves genuine curiosity and asking questions. And when I say genuine, I really mean it. So you can't be asking people kind of leading questions and kind of showing that you think that they're stupid or ignorant or something by asking those questions. You genuinely need to care and be curious about why they think what they think. And so that Socratic method is much more likely to lead to persuasion in the end, in the future, and someday, than actual persuasion with facts and things like that. And so, this process of the Socratic method is asking questions with curiosity and drawing out ideas, their implications, and kind of getting at the presuppositions of people and kind of extending their story to the end of hopefully finding contradictions and then things that you might learn from as well in that process.
Yeah, that sounds like Advanced Thanksgiving 301.
Yeah.
But going back to 101, I just want to make sure I understand. When you say, don't throw out facts, that can turn into a shouting match with people with different facts, even if you're right, basically. And so the idea is to explain, how you feel and why it matters to you so that they're seeing it as coming from you as a person, rather than just a fact that they can deflect.
That's right. Generally speaking, facts will not make a big difference, and it's going to lead to frustration and to heated arguments that I think should be just generally avoided. And you can provide facts, but they have to be, I think, within a story, within something personal, within something deeper. And really, if it gets to a very heated conversation, I would say, exiting that is more important, and saying something like, we can agree to disagree. And even if you want to be more Gandhian, provide a hug and say, we're here for gratitude and Thanksgiving, and we're here for love. And actually, what's more important is that we're all Americans. We want our country to work for our children, something like that.
Yeah. Sometimes you might say, I appreciate the opportunity to understand your perspective, even if I don't agree with it. So I want to just ask you one other question. I know that you don't just study Thanksgiving. Like, these techniques and this work are really relevant to turmoil all around the world, to places where violence has erupted with horrible outcomes. You're studying this issue of in-group, out-group, where there is just, a crazy amount at stake. How do these techniques add up? I mean, how are they used to try to address these incredibly difficult challenges today?
Definitely. I think all of these skills and kind of commentary about peace building and dialogue and the way to engage others applies much more broadly than just a Thanksgiving dinner, and even beyond the U.S. context, really. I study places that have, transitional countries from dictatorship to democracy, where you need a process of healing that is, of a great magnitude after thousands of people have died and people tortured and things like that. So very, post-conflict societies. And what's important here is just to remember that the bigger picture, why it matters that you have a civil conversation, why it matters that we stay together and don't go down the route of political violence. It's much harder to solve once it does than just to have disagreements, even if they're personal ones. I would say that keeping all of these things in mind is important. And there are actually organizations in the US that are dedicated to bringing this about for others, for people in the community. So there's an organization called Braver Angels, and they actually have a workshop to help people do this with their families and their communities.
Interesting. So this is a technique for Thanksgiving. It's a technique in part for more than just families. It's a technique for political adversaries. And hopefully it's something that can take the temperature down in a world that sometimes seems like it just keeps getting hotter.
That's right. Yeah, I think we can use this and apply it in many different contexts. And obviously, it's very different when you're in the workplace, where you might want to avoid these conversations in general. But with family, sometimes you have to engage, and sometimes you want to engage, not just with family, but also when you do community organizing or you're at church or something like that. And these are skills that you can apply everywhere. And what's really important is that democracy requires a really strong social fabric. It requires a certain level of trust, a certain level of understanding that the other, is not the enemy and is not evil. That's the bare minimum for a democracy to work. Because again, this social contract, this understanding that the other is going to rule over all of us, whether you voted or not. And that's, if you don't accept that, we're going to have bigger problems of political violence down the line.
Well, Dr. Amat, thank you so much for joining us on Public Health on Call. And I hope you and your family have a wonderful Thanksgiving.
Thank you so much for having me, Josh, and happy Thanksgiving to you and to all the listeners.
Public Health on Call is produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith-Rogers, and Stephanie Desmond. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Holly Cardinell, Spencer Greer, and Matthew Martin with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production support from Catherine Ricardo. Social media run by Grace Holes Fernandez and Amber Bryan Singletary. Thank you for listening.